All right, we're going to turn to Matthew chapter 5. Not an obscure text at all. And after Jesus gives the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which we will not read, but he does say, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, that kind of thing. He talks about these people who are blessed and tells why they're blessed. Then he says to his disciples in verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And then another verse I want to read, and then I'll talk about our topic. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, we'll start there. Philippians 2, 14 and following. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Now, I was asked last week, and I did speak on the subject of following Christ in the present culture. And obviously that's a very large subject. I think a little over a year ago I gave a talk here about radically Christian counterculture. I have a whole series of lectures online about that. I'm not going to go into that in depth. This is going to be more of an exhortation and encouragement rather than digging out deep spiritual truths. I plan to actually go shorter than usual. I'm going to watch myself on this. Yeah. When Jesus said we are the salt of the earth and we're the light of the world, we've all heard those things. And yet in Philippians, when he says we shine as lights, he says we are children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. We've read those verses, some of us all our lives, and we've accepted that we were living in a perverse and crooked generation, even though by today's standards it was considerably less perverse or crooked than what we face now. And when we do face it, when we're aware of the direction things are going and the rapidity of the descent into darkness in our society, we realize that this is a corrupt, a perverse, crooked generation. Now, we tend to blame, whatever the millennials or Generation Z or whoever's came up behind us. But really, many of us are baby boomers. Our generation is the one that dropped the ball. Maybe our parents dropped it a little bit. Every generation has people who don't do as well as they should. But it was the baby boomer generation, my generation, that received from the previous generation the most privileged world. Being Americans after World War II, America for the first time became a world superpower. Because we're a superpower, we've never been attacked on our soil until 9/11, or well, of course Pearl Harbor, but we've never had war taking place, going on our soil. We've lived in a land of peace. We became, the wealthiest, most comfortable, most spoiled people of any generation anywhere in the world. We have taken much of it for granted. We've known that in other parts of the world, Christians suffer persecution. We know there's poor people in third world countries. We're aware of them. Some of us have gone to those countries. Some of us help financially people in those countries. But we've always taken largely for granted that we will have things pretty much like they were when we were being raised. But in doing so, we who raised children, we baby boomers, some of us failed. We didn't mean to fail. We've all tried to raise our children in the faith, but frankly, my generation somehow didn't. We didn't recognize, I suppose, how quickly things were changing, and how difficult it was going to be to hold on to our children. So most kids now who are raised in Christian homes and identify as Christians, when they go away to college, a huge percentage of them, they lose their faith. They deconvert. And that, I mean, there's always been some attrition, obviously, when kids get old enough to leave their parents' homes. But this is just phenomenal. In fact, there's so many kids deconverting that some of the large churches that are trying to cater to those kids, the pastors themselves are deconstructing their faith and deconverting so that they can, I guess, stay up with the times or something. But this has only caused more rapidly the culture to deteriorate, because no church really wants to be seen as, irrelevant. And when churches hold on to standards that the culture is very quickly saying, that's old, that's irrelevant, that's not true, we've advanced beyond that. No pastor wants to look like he's an old stick in the mud. And so there's a great temptation for the church to to put the light under a bushel, or to put it out altogether, or for the salt to lose its flavor. Now, Jesus said, if the salt loses its flavor, it's good for nothing, except to be cast out and trodden under the feet of men. Now, I think we're living in that time when the flavorless, unsalty church, which is compromised in many ways at times, is pretty much we Christians who are remaining unmoved and uncompromised from what every Christian believed 30 years ago, let's say. We're seen as the oddballs. We're being kind of excluded, and the church is more and more being trodden underfoot of men. Not in a literal sense, of course. Jesus wasn't being literal, but in the sense that what we have to say is disdained. When I was young, most people I knew were not Christians, but most people I knew who were not Christians thought being a Christian was probably a good thing, maybe a better thing than they wanted to try. They didn't really want to be Christians, but they kind of looked at Christians as people who were making a choice toward goodness, and that the Bible, even if no one wanted to read it or listen to it or follow it, I think the world in general looked at the Bible as a good book at the very least, if not the Word of God. I know that when I was growing up, it seemed to me that most of the people, even the non-Christians I witnessed to, had a respect for the Bible, even if they didn't know much about it, and had some respect for Christians, though they didn't want to be one. But of course now, things have turned upside down. So evil is called good and good is called evil. So the Bible is actually seen as a bad book, and Christians are seen as haters and somebody who's really detrimental to society. And of course, you'd expect the devil to see us that way. But not everyone was so much in sync with the devil until very recently. It's almost as if Satan has been loosed upon the world to deceive the world again, and in a big way. I mean, Satan's always been doing things throughout the world. There's always been deceived people. But this is fairly global that's going on. And that's partly due to the fact that it's a global community. Social media connects everybody. Bad ideas as well as good ones get around the world in an instant, and billions of people see them. And people who don't have any better sense just buy into whatever it looks like all their friends are saying. And so the culture has just, it's not a slippery slope. We've reached the cliff, and it's a plunge now into the abyss. Now, that doesn't mean things can't turn around. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. I'm saying it's a different world. It certainly is the end of the world that we were raised in, most of us. And it's a different world. And our mission is not different. But we look at the world differently, probably. I mean, if you watch news and you see that, the police are considered the bad guys, the felons are the good guys, the ones you don't put felons in jail, but you defund police, you think, wait, where did common sense go? when literally perversion is celebrated, they'll have a whole month to celebrate perversion. They'll have parades to celebrate perversion. And the main corporations and the main companies are, waving the flag of perversion. I mean, there's always been perverts out there, and Christians have always been called to love them and reach out to them and try to help them. But the society largely marginalized perversion because the society wasn't perverted itself. But that's changed. The society is perverted. And the church more and more is an alternative society. Paul said, you live as children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse world. And so the temptation then, of course, is to not speak up or to not speak boldly or not to speak clearly our message, because we know that more and more, first of all, people won't like us for it, and nobody really wants to be disliked, but many of us have gotten used to the fact that non-Christians are not going to like us because we're going to stand for things they don't believe in. But it's not that they don't like us only. It's that to a very large degree they think we're evil. We are an element in society that more and more is going to be seen as something that needs to be removed one way or another. They're trying to do it gradually through the educational system, just bringing up generations that don't know anything about what we know because they're not allowed to be taught it there, and who are being downloaded perversion into their heads and foolishness. And the Bible says in Jeremiah, they've forsaken the word of the Lord. What wisdom is in them? When people don't know the word of the Lord, I used to think that if there was no Bible, we'd still have kind of a fairly decent society. I mean, most people are decent folks, aren't they? But we see now that all the decency that was in our society that we took for granted was all owed to the influence of Christianity and the Bible. And as that influence has been forced aside and marginalized, we see that fewer and fewer people, even people who identified as Christian, can understand. If you asked almost any Christian 10 years ago, I think I'd be fair in saying 10 years ago. It's hard to know exactly what year would be best for this illustration. But if you ask them, what do you think about same-sex marriage? You wouldn't find a Christian in 50 who thought that was a good thing. But now every Christian has a nephew or a niece or a son or a daughter or a good friend or a good friend's son or daughter who's, in a same-sex marriage. And there's this pressure to say, well, I don't want to alienate them. They're nice people. I mean, well, of course, they may be very nice people. But they're in the dark. And people in the dark need light. And Jesus said, we are the light of the world, and you have light. You don't put that light under a bushel, or else it's of no value at all. Although if you do bring light in a dark room, some people's eyes are pierced with the light in such a way as to react adversely. Nobody really likes it very much if someone shines a bright light in their face when they're in a dark place. I mean, your eyes have to adjust. And some people don't want to adjust. They just want to have their eyes accustomed to darkness. And then we bring in a light, and it's a very unwelcome light. Now, Jesus said in John chapter 3 that the Son of God did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He said, because the world's already condemned. Jesus didn't have to come and condemn the world. He said, he that doesn't believe in him is condemned already. And then it says, and this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. But he that does good loves the light and brings his deeds to the light, so that they may be shown to be done in God. But people who want to do evil want to keep the lights low. They want to do it in the shadows. Until, of course, they can do it in the light and no one complains anymore. But you see, what really happens is once the society has gotten to a place where you can do these things in the light, well, then the whole light is darkness. And when we bring our light, which is the true light, they have the same reaction to when they had to conceal their behavior before. They don't have to conceal it for public approval anymore, but that makes it almost worse, because of course they've gotten used to the fact that they're not doing anything shameful. They're not doing anything that needs to be hidden. And then when we come along and say, well, that's actually bad, that's actually evil, that's actually goes against what God wants, and it's going to be something God will judge. Well, they don't want to hear that, of course, and none of their friends are going to tell them that. Even their Christian friends are probably kind of zipping their lip when they're around them, because more and more Christians just want to get along. It's uncomfortable to be in a world where you can't get along even if you express your opinion. And especially with the new woke agenda, it's not even that, if you express your opinion contrary, that it's an unpopular opinion. It's that you're not allowed to express a contrary opinion, because that's hateful. It's not just that you've got a different opinion, you're stupid. It's that it's hateful to even have a different opinion. And so you become not just someone who's benighted and ignorant and someone that they can laugh at your views. They don't laugh at your views. They react violently to your views because you're a hater. You're a Nazi. You're a white supremacist or something. What'll get you called a white supremacist doesn't have to have anything to do with being white. You can be black, and if you take certain views different than the status quo, you'll be called a white supremacist. And so, it just shows that the world has gotten so far into the darkness that they've had to become and maintain an irrationality. Now, I wanted to talk about following Christ faithfully, and I'm going to say more about certain examples that we need to bear in mind than certain teachings. We know the teachings. We know we're supposed to follow Jesus. We have to obey Jesus. But I want us to just remember certain people, if we could. The earliest of which probably that we need to think about would be Joseph, sold by his brothers into Egypt. And the reason he's someone to remember is because he knew the Lord. And he came from a family that knew the Lord or knew about the Lord. His brothers didn't seem to know the Lord, but his dad did. And his mom probably did. So he came from a family that was at least culturally a believing family. But he was taken away into a land that was culturally pagan. And he was in a household as a slave where there wasn't a single believer or morality that he approved of. So that the wife of his master tried to seduce him. And here he's a young man, 17 years old. Yeah, he's got the hormones of a young man. He's far from anyone who has morals like his. He's in a place where he could probably fit in and even succumb to the temptation, and there's not anyone going to judge him. At least no godly people will know it. He's got no accountability except before God. And that's the point. He has accountability before God. When the wife of Potiphar tried to seduce him, he said, "My master has put everything under my hand and given me charge over everything except you." He said, "How can I do this evil and sin against God?" You almost experience say, "How can I do this evil and sin against my master? My master's been good to me. He trusts me. How can I sin against him? How can I betray him?" And no doubt Joseph did feel that way, but there was something more dominant in his thinking. How can I do this evil thing and sin against God? After all, if he was thinking only in terms of his master and trying to not betray his master, the devil and the temptress could probably say, "My master's never going to find out about it. We can be discreet. We can get away with this. There's nothing. He's not going to hurt for it. What he doesn't know won't hurt him." But Joseph knew that even when there's no human accountability, that God was watching, and that if he did that, it was going to offend God. And that God consciousness is what every person has to have if they're going to be faithful in a world where fewer and fewer people are going to judge you for doing the wrong thing. Fewer and fewer people, more and more people are going to judge you for doing the right thing. And so to realize that God is the only one that you have to please in a society where everyone else is a pagan. Now, we don't live in that society yet because we've got us. We've got Christians. There are other Christians outside this room as well as inside this room that affirm the basics of what we believe. And maybe if God is good to us that way, that maybe we'll never be cut off from fellowship. But there are people in the world who are. Richard Wurmbrand was in solitary confinement for 3 years because of his uncompromising stand. Corrie ten Boom and her sister were put into prison, but her sister died there, and they didn't have Christian friends in there, but they had to stay strong. That's happened a lot. Daniel's another good example of this. Daniel was, like Joseph, taken away from the Jewish society and from everyone who believed like he did. Only a few went with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did too, but they were put into this culture, totally pagan culture, that didn't have any of the morals or the standards that they have. And we read in Daniel, I think it's chapter 1, verse 8, it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Now, in that case, it's talking about defiling himself with unkosher food, but you don't have to, you could just stop right there. He didn't defile himself in that or any other area because he purposed in his heart not to do so. And I think a lot of times when you live in a culture that isn't hateful of all that you stand for, and where a certain element, even in the unbeliever culture, stands for some of the things that Christians stand for because it's residual in the society from the influence of the gospel over the centuries, that you can pretty much get by without having made the kind of purposing in your heart that Daniel had to make. I'm not saying that we aren't always required to do that, but I'm saying a person in a quasi-Christian society can, they can refrain from, let's say, fornication or adultery, and most people say, yeah, boy, it sucks to be you, but I'm proud of you that you can do that, because they think you've got good standards. It's hard enough, frankly, to live in the world and to avoid temptations, even when the society is to a large extent on your side about things like that. But when you, now in a changing society, Daniel's society changed pretty much overnight. He was removed from his home in Israel and transplanted in a totally pagan world. And he just said, okay, it's not going to be as easy. In Israel, it was easy to eat a kosher diet. In Israel, it was easy not to bow down to idols. In Israel, no one was doing those things, or at least most good people were not. But here in Babylon, everyone's bowing down to the idols. Everyone's eating unkosher food. Everyone's immoral. This is the culture I've just been in. Now, our culture has come upon us and become that way gradually, and we might not have noticed it. But when he did, he couldn't help but notice he was changed, and he realized, I need to purpose in my heart. Because if I don't have a settled purpose in my heart, not to defile myself, then I'll slip, I'll fall, I'll compromise. And I've just got to make a decision. I'm going to define who I am here in this new place. I'm not a Babylonian. I'm not an idolater. I'm not a pagan. Everyone I meet might be. And I'm going to get into trouble with people. And he did. He was fed to the lions because he didn't go along. Remember, because he was godly, the other satraps and governors and stuff despised him, and they're the ones who entrapped him before Darius, so he'd be thrown to the den of lions. And Daniel knew that was going to happen, not before they made the law, but once they made the law, he knew it was going to happen. When the law was made for 6 months, or for 30 days, I think it was, no one can pray to any god except King Darius. Well, right then, Daniel knew, okay, I'm going to go in the lion's den. There's no way I'm going to avoid that because I'm not going to stop praying. I'm not going to be secretive about it. He opened his windows to pray after that, out loud. I mean, I think I would find a closet, like Jesus said, and pray very privately in a case like that. But he didn't go underground. I mean, sometimes the church goes underground, and perhaps that's what it needs to do to stay alive in some countries. But he didn't take his religion underground. He just didn't compromise. He just said, well, I have a certain way of worshiping God. I've always done it. Suddenly it's illegal for me to do it that way. But why should any law have any impact on my worship of God? I'm not going to do anything differently. And, we are now in a society where some of the laws are now even being changed. Thankfully, the Supreme Court just determined last week, you probably heard about it, that a Christian who designed websites, she had decided not to do a website for I forget what it was, gay couple or some promoting some kind of homosexual agenda, and she had been taken to court about it, and the Supreme Court judged that she has the right for freedom of religion to do that. That law, if it's reapplied to those cake designers and photographers and stuff who wouldn't participate in gay weddings, they may be vindicated in the end. God may be turning some things around, but the enemy will come in like a flood. No question about that. We might get one step forward and there could be 10 steps backward before you know it. We have to realize that the world hates what we stand for. And the pressure, peer pressure, social pressure, is very, very great. And the only way we'll stay unmoved is if we're purposed in our heart not to compromise ourselves in that area. Pharaoh's midwives did that, remember? They were the Jewish midwives, but when Pharaoh said to kill all the Jewish babies, it says the midwives ignored him. And they were taking the chance that they'd get in serious trouble for that. God preserved them. God blessed them. But sometimes when Christians buck the system, God doesn't preserve them in the same sense. He doesn't get them off the hook with the authorities. Sometimes we get to be martyrs. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, this is obviously the faith chapter, but I'm just going to look at a paragraph or so in it. Verse 32 and following, Hebrews 11:32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens, and women received their dead back to life again. Then it says, others who had just as much faith as the other group we just read about, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. Now, notice he says, by faith there are people who turned to flight the armies of aliens and escaped the edge of the sword. But some by faith were slain by the sword. There are those who by faith stopped the mouths of lions. Others were fed to the lions. There are some who quenched the violence of fire. There's others like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, they actually quenched the violence of fire themselves. God did for them. But there are many Christians have died burned at the stake. In other words, just because you have faith doesn't mean you'll be delivered from hardship. It means that if you have hardship, your faith will sustain you. Your faith in God will sustain you in hardship, and God may even work miraculous ways to deliver you, as he gives examples that have happened many times. On the other hand, you may have the same amount of faith, and things can go terribly wrong in the natural sense. In other words, you can be delivered over to every trial and disaster and death that you'd have if you didn't have faith. But the difference is you have faith, and because you die on good terms with God. And of that latter group, it says the world was not worthy of them. I have to say that I don't know if there's a time in my lifetime previously where it was as true as it is now, that the world we live in is not worthy of the saints. The saints who have nothing in mind but to help, nothing in mind but to save them, to get them out of the pit that they're in, to bring light in their darkness, to uphold standards which, if they don't like them, at least their children may benefit if we can prevail. The saints are here serving God, and as servants of God, serving humanity and culture. And yet the world hates that. A growing percentage of the world hates that. And the world's not even worthy of us. And that's not a boast about ourselves. You see, we are salt. Now, in biblical times, salt wasn't pure like our table salt. They had really very few ways to mine salt out of the earth and separate from it all the granules of sand and stuff like that. And they just tolerated that in their salt. And they kept their salt in bins which sometimes when it rained, it would leach out. So all was left was the sand and stuff after the salt leached out. And that's what Jesus said, if the salt loses its savor. The salt is considered all the contents of the salt bin. But if the real salt leaches out and there's only sand left, the salt in the bin isn't salty anymore. So there's no salt left in it. And he says, then they'll throw it out. And so only those who purpose in their heart, like Daniel did, that they will not allow their saltiness to be diminished, to be compromised, or allow their light to be put under a bushel because of intimidation. Only those will be of any use to God and to the world. And we don't know how it's going to turn at this point. In the last, I'd say the last decade, a culture that still had a very, in many respects, strong conscience toward Christianity, certainly compared to lands that never knew Christianity. There was residual truth and knowledge of God in the land, even among those who weren't Christians but benefited from a Christian heritage of this country. That heritage is despised and being rejected as quickly as they can. Now, we don't know if God's going to respond and say, yeah, well, you thought you're going to get rid of us, but not so easy. You know, there could be a revival. There are good things happening in some parts of this country. But back in the Jesus movement, there's a tremendous revival. And an organization like YWAM starts up where they got tens of thousands of people, radical Christians, pouring out, discipling the nations. And yet, even with that, the nations of the world still are desiring to grow darker and darker and darker. And this one, we need to make sure that we are not of those who say, well, maybe we should rethink our values here. You know, I mean, a lot of people, even Christians, even pastors, are saying maybe we should just allow same-sex marriage in our church. Maybe we should just embrace transgenderism. I mean, think of those poor people. They're suffering so much. It's compassionate to embrace and affirm them. No, it is not. It's not compassionate to allow people to live in their delusion when you can tell them the truth. Now, if you tell them the truth and they still want to live in their delusion, well, it is compassionate to let them go their own way. I mean, compassionate is not really the word. It's just justice. You can't really make decisions for their life like that. But you can decide for your life. You can decide whether you're going to remain silent and watch the thing deteriorate, or whether you're going to speak. But we need to be, as Jesus said, harmless as doves, though we need to be wise as serpents. In this culture, following Jesus is going to be costlier. I don't know if we're going to see, you know, the Christians rounded up and put into camps like the Japanese were rounded up in World War II and put into centers, or like the Jews were in Nazi Germany and so forth. I don't know if that'll happen to Christians in this country in my lifetime. I will say this. For 50 years, I have anticipated the possibility that could happen here. I was fortunate to have read Richard Wurmbrand's works and Corrie ten Boom's books and Fox's Book of Martyrs when I was young. And so, to me, unlike a lot of my friends, I guess, because I find that a lot of people find this strange, but from the time I was a teenager, I just figured being arrested, put into a prison camp, going to jail, maybe being killed for faith, that's about average, really. That's about average historically. You know, it hasn't been average for us in this part of the world in this time in history, but that's normal. I mean, Peter said, do not think it a strange thing when you're suffering these things, you know, when these fiery trials come upon you, as if some strange thing happened to you. He says, no, you're glorifying God when you do that. The glory of God rests upon you when you're doing that. That's something you need to just accept as not a strange thing at all. And it is strange to us because we do live in the unique time that the past 70 years has been since World War II. America has just been a unique place. It's been the place where people who are refugees from other countries come to, generally speaking. Now, a lot of Christians I'm talking about, where can we go from America? But there's not really very good answers. when America ceases to be a witness, a light, a refuge for justice and so forth, I'm not sure another place in the world might arise. I mean, there might be other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, China, parts of South America, where the revival, I mean, there's so many people converted and so rapidly, maybe those places will become the next free countries when America goes Marxist. You never know. What God will do, we can't say. This is not really doom and gloom, because even though it's very gloomy and doomy right now, God may surprise us all and turn things around or supply some other options. But he hasn't yet. I mean, right now, we live in the world we are now in. And so we have to just say, it may not get any better in my lifetime. Hopefully it will. We need to pray for that. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But his will on earth might even include persecution. Jesus said, these things I've spoken unto you, that in me you'll have peace. In the world, you'll have persecution. But be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. We can't be sure that persecution isn't the will of God. But we do need to make sure that we are not only praying, but resigning ourselves to the will of God. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Whether that makes an easy road for me or a hard road, I'm not going to change, except in ways that God wants me to change, which is going to be for the better, not for the worse. So, to be like Daniel, standing alone in a wicked culture, like Joseph, standing alone in a wicked culture, and many others throughout history, obviously. I think often, maybe this is one other verse I'll give and then we'll be done. This is Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 predicts the time of what we call the Maccabean revolt and the Maccabean war. What had happened in Israel about 168 years before Christ is that Antiochus Epiphanes, a tyrant to the north in the Greco-Syrian Empire, he made frequent attempts to attack Egypt. And the problem was that Syria was north of Israel, Egypt was south of Israel. So the armies of Syria trampled through Israel on their way to invade Egypt. And they didn't really do that well in conquering Egypt. In fact, they failed. And therefore, he'd come back through Israel angry and Antiochus take his anger out on the Jews, who had nothing to do with his problems. But he wasn't exactly a moral guy. So in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jews were forbidden by law from possessing a copy of the Bible, the Torah, from circumcising their children, from keeping Sabbath, and from virtually everything else that was distinctive of their law. Now, we don't have to keep Sabbath and circumcise our children and have the Torah, but of course, their situation, if we were living back then, we would be, if we were Jews, we'd be deciding, do I give up circumcising my child, which God commands? Do I give up keeping Sabbath, which God commands, in order to avoid getting killed? Now, in that day, there were a group of Jews called the Hasidim who rose up and refused. They didn't fight, they just refused to accept the culture, the Hellenizing culture that Antiochus was trying to bring in. And they were slaughtered. And many of them would not even lift a sword on the Sabbath. So they were just slaughtered unilaterally in cold blood rather than in a war. Well, a war did break out with another group of people. An old priest named Mattathias killed a Syrian official who was trying to make him offer a sacrifice to an idol. And he and his sons fled to the wilderness and started what's called the Maccabean Revolt. And they ran guerrilla raids on the Syrians until after 3 years they finally drove the Syrians out of their land. Now, Daniel is talking about that time in Daniel chapter 11. And I just want to focus on one thing it says about them. In what verse do I want to look at? It's a long chapter here. Okay. It says in verse 32, Daniel 11:32, those who do wickedly against the covenant shall corrupt He will corrupt with flattery. That's the Jews who compromised and obeyed Antiochus, and he corrupted them. It says those who forsake the covenant, these are disloyal Jews, will, as it says, he'll corrupt them with flatteries. Then it says, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now, when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help. But many shall join with them by intrigue. That's not real loyal friends. And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for an appointed time. Now, till the time of the end of that ordeal. This is talking about Antiochus sets up the abomination of desolation, which is he put an altar to Zeus in the Jewish temple. And that began this period of time, which was so hard on the Jews, the loyal Jews. But it says those who knew their God, those who know their God will be strong and do exploits, he said. And he says they'll be purified, they'll be made white, they'll be slaughtered, they'll die by sword and by flame, it says. But God, in that case, did raise up a resistance movement that finally drove the enemy out. So, I mean, it was an open-ended thing as far as the people going through it. For them, that might be the end. It may be that everyone who's loyal to God is going to be killed by this guy. But, in fact, God had other plans, and Antiochus lost. And I personally am not sure what God's plans are for us now. If we ask, is this the end of the world? I don't have any convictions that it is the end of the world, but I'm also sure. I'm not sure if God's going to bring some revival or something else that's going to turn things around again. That'd be a lovely thing. We certainly need to be praying for that. But if not, we need to just purpose in our hearts that if there's going to be some who die by the sword or by flames and are made white and purified, then we'll be among them if necessary. And that's the position that Christians have always had to take until our generation, until modern times. Christians everywhere in the world have had to face that kind of choice. And we need to be very much aware that we are making that choice, and it's not a strange thing. It's strange from our perspective because of our experience of the past 70 years in this country, but it's not a strange thing in terms of what Christians have been called to do and what they've had to go through before. So I just wanted to give that. Again, I wasn't going to, like I said, didn't really teach anything, but I just wanted to exhort a little bit and encourage.